Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Johnson, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the Reed Muse 1C turntable and the 5T tangential tracking tone arm. This combination of turntable and tone arm come from the Reed Audio Company out of Lithuania in Europe. And it's been on the market for a number of years now, but it's a very unique set of turntable and tone arm designs. The turntable, the 1C, is kind of the entry-level turntable in the Reed lineup. It starts around $15,000, and this combination with this drive system and this finish, which is in a birch finish, it is $17,200 US without the tone arm option. There are a number of different tone arms that Reed sells that can be fitted with this turntable. However, this particular model is fitted with the 5T tone arm, and that is a electronic tangential tracking tone arm, and we'll get into more of that later. Going over the specifics of the 1C, this is a wood-bodied turntable, not an MDF-bodied turntable. This is finished in a birch finish. It's also available in a black for a slightly lower cost. And Reed also offer this in two different drive systems, a belt drive system or a friction drive system. This particular model here is in the friction drive option. It uses two rubber rim drive wheels, DC motors, to spin a aluminum machine subplatter. The concept of a rim drive or friction drive is not new. In the 1950s and the 1960s, this was the choice of a lot of industry standard broadcast turntables. And a lot of turntables that collectors still value, like the Garrard 301, used this technology. There are some benefits to rim drive, and some people thought it a much more sonically stable and reliable method than belt drive. But it is, of course, much more costly to produce. The 1C does have a quartz control system for its motors, and the two different rim drive wheels, the rubber wheels that spin the subplatter, are of different sizes, so they do spin at different speeds. The platter material is a type of Delrin, and it does have aluminum inserts in it. So despite the fact that it's a rather thin piece of Delrin, it has an extra added amount of weight in certain places due to the metal inserts. And having picked up the platter a few times, it definitely has more mass to it than I would expect from a Delrin platter of that size and thickness. Reed described that they use these metal inserts, especially in the center, to provide torque and speed stability, as opposed to a solid one solid frequency of mass throughout the platter. So attached to this turntable, my particular model has the Reed 5T tone arm. This is a tangential tracking tone arm, and it retails for the whopping price of $21,500 US, thereabouts. It's a very interesting tone arm design. Let's start with the tone arm itself, which is a wood body, not a carbon fiber or other synthetic material that we're more used to with turntable designs. So they do offer solid wood tone arm designs with this. And there's a number of different woods you can select. This comes with the standard Wenge wood. There's also other options, such as, I believe, cocobola and rosewood and thereabouts. The reason that Reed offer different woods for their tone arm choices is because those have different effective masses. And so you can kind of pair the wood of your choice with the cartridge of your choice and kind of narrow in mass and compliance and things like that. This comes with the standard Wenge wood option, and it proved fine for both of the two cartridges I used for this review. The core design philosophy of the 5T tone arm is that of a tangential tracking tone arm. What that means is a traditional pivoted tone arm design has one pivot point, and that is at the base of the axis. So essentially, as the record moves, the tone arm rotates on a single axis like this. The con that people have always noted with this type of tone arm design is that there are points at which the cartridge will move out of parallel sync with the grooves, and there will be some level of mistracking that may yield some type of minor or major distortion depending on the record, depending on the tone arm, etc. Now, a lot of the solution for many years, the solution to that technical problem has been a linear tracking tone arms. We all remember the linear tracking arms of, the 1980s and the 1990s. Technics made a good number of them. And those designs have more or less been in production, since that time. And there's a number of great linear tracking arms out there today, but linear tracking does introduce its own problems. You essentially have, you often are dealing with complicated motor systems, complicated systems of realizing whereabouts in the record you are, and the motor always correcting. They yield their own problems, and oftentimes, in order to do that right, is a great expense. Now, a tangential tracking tone arm is a little bit different than a typical linear tracking tone arm because it still does use a traditional tone arm pivot. However, it also moves the tone arm along a path with this battery-powered motor we have here. So essentially, as the tone arm moves and pivots and rotates, the base of the pivot moves along with it so that the cartridge is always in an ideal parallel configuration with the grooves. The Reed 5T tone arm has a very unique solution to the problem of interference or noise in the tone arm. So this tone arm actually comes with a 12-volt battery unit, a rechargeable battery unit, and it's actually two 12-volt battery system. This battery pack kind of sits alongside the turntable, and you're able to basically have up to 12 hours of play with one battery. And then when that battery runs out of charge, you can switch instantly by turning a knob to the other reserve battery that has been charging while your current battery is in use. And then while that new battery is in use, the depleted battery will recharge. In addition to the unique power design of this tone arm, the tone arm also uses a laser-guided sensor for its tangential tracking. So essentially, in the back of the tone arm, right here, there is a laser emitter. You can see it maybe hitting my thumb there. And that laser emitter tracks to a sensor back here that is able to make sure that the tone arm is always centered parallel with the record, following the tangential tracking route that the motor is supposed to follow, to make sure that the tone arm is always straight, parallel with the geometry that it's assigned. This method of guidance in tangential tracking, ingenious as it may be, does lead to a slightly different operation than I think most turntable users will be used to, certainly that I'm used to. So let me demonstrate this by putting on a record real quick. This is the new Meshkey Records reissue of Inu Don't Eat Food, and let's cue this up here. So there are essentially speed selectors on the side, 78, 45, 33, and 16 if you ever need 16. And the turntable gets to speed fairly quickly. But let's take a look at the tone arm here. So right by the tone arm sensor back here is a light that is either green or flashing red and green. Now, flashing red and green indicates that the tangential tracking laser is not aligned. The tone arm is not aligned. So what we want to do is navigate the tone arm over to the lead-in groove, and it's going to be a very different sensation than most people are used to, because most people are used to moving a tone arm like this. Well, when you're lining up the reed, you kind of have to work it on both axes. You get that laser somewhat in the center of the sensor back there, and then you hit a button on the back of the laser sensor to align the table. And you'll see that the tone arm will move ever so slightly to get into perfect alignment. And then the alignment is set. And you should not need to reset it again unless you physically move the tone arm with your hands. So now we are able to cue the lead-in groove, just like that. So my first time using this, it was quite scary, and it took a little while to get used to. But once you get the hang of it, the daily, everyday use of this tone arm does get much easier, and it becomes simple, just like using any other tone arm. I mean, I'm sure people using unipivot tone arms are used to a little bit of finickiness in cueing and setting and things like that. But once you get to the actual playing, it behaves just the same as any other tone arm you would expect. The tone armrest on the Reed is rather interesting because instead of a clip, it has a screw on the bottom. Now, I was a little wary of using a screw on a wooden tone arm to secure it in place. However, the bottom of the screw is rounded, and the top of the tone arm clip actually contains a couple of like gelatin or rubber bumpers, so that it actually is very easy on the tone arm. I was expecting, you know, to be very scared of denting the tone arm, but this doesn't appear to be the case with the way they've designed the Reed tone arm clip. Now, setup of this table is another story. The setup was a very complicated affair, and if you're interested in this turntable, I would really recommend negotiating setup with a trained dealer, because I've set up a lot of turntables in my day. The Reed scared me a little bit. The turntable didn't necessarily scare me, but the setup of the tone arm was a little frightening, and it took you know, 2 people very experienced with this turntable to do it successfully, something I don't think I would have wanted to attempt by myself, because this is a very sensitive piece of equipment. The motor track is very sensitive. There's a number of very specific screws that have to be installed, and misaligning those can yield to mistracking or things like that, problems with the operation of the tone arm system. So that is something to think about if this is a turntable that interests you, is that it's not going to be the simple and easy plug and play setup that you may be used to with other more traditional pivoted design tone arms. But you know, if that sounds too complicated for you, Reed do make other more traditional style tone arm designs to go with their turntables. When the folks at Access Audio first set up this table for me, they set it up with a cartridge that is often paired with the Reed tables, the Airtight PC1 moving coil cartridge. I don't know if you can see it there. There we go, the Airtight PC1 Coda. And I found the combination of the Reed turntable tone arm and Airtight to be an incredibly detailed and resolving experience, one that was really strong in areas of soundstage, almost no noise, super black backgrounds, and incredibly resolving in terms of imaging of instruments, space around instruments, and things like that. So let me give you some examples. One of the things I've always heard about idler wheel drive turntables, friction drive turntables, is that they are incredibly good at resolving the natural air and decay of acoustic instruments. And so one of the first records I played was this analog phonic reissue of the Franck and Debussy violin sonatas with Kung Wah Chung and Radu Lupu on Decca. You know, this is a late 70s Decca recording, so it is a little bit drier than some of their more tube-oriented 60s recordings. But I think this is a fantastic chamber record, and one that you can get a lot of nuance out of the recording. I was very, very impressed with the how this turntable rendered Chung's violin tone. I thought it was incredibly realistic, and you really got a sense of the change in tone and color of her playing when she was doing, like, you know, greater pressure, bow speed, or a more relaxed sound. Like the first movement of the Franck is a lighter sound that she was using, and when we get to the allegro in the second movement, I mean, she is giving a lot of power and a lot of resonance in her playing, and the depth of the sound, how the sound decayed in the space, and how much resonance and kind of there was in her tone. The Reed rendered that very, very well, better than I've heard any other turntable do. And again, with Radu Lupu's piano. Piano is a very difficult instrument for a turntable to render. It's a difficult instrument for any equipment to render accurately. I don't know if I've ever heard a piano sound on a hi-fi system that sounded 100% like I was listening to it in a recital hall. I've heard some very, very good, very resolving systems, but there's always, piano is always like a little bit of a giveaway that you're listening to a recording and not the real thing. But with the Reed, in this combination, in this tone arm, with the Airtight, it was the illusion was very, very good. There was a lot of ring and air around Lupu's piano sound, but there was also a lot of grunt and depth, and some of that low ring that you hear in a really well recorded piano sound that you sometimes just don't get on the recording. Sometimes you get to the low end of the piano and it sounds just kind of just one tone color and not a lot of like low boom or resonance, and you really do get that listening to this recording on this table. I found it very, very impressive. As I brought up before, I'm currently reviewing this reissue by Meshkey Records of a 1981 post-punk album by the short-lived band Inu. And this is kind of a pummeling, energetic, thunderous 1981 kind of raw vintage recording. And I was very impressed with how much instrumental separation you were able to get out of a punk band for this. Very, very clear, distinct bass lines, great air around the instruments, some of these really, really cutting, biting, jangly, icy, kind of Susie and the Banshees or Smith-style guitar tones that they were employing come through great. Excellent transient attacks on this table, and almost no kind of muddying or muddle that isn't baked into the recording already. The turntable was not, imparting any of that. And sometimes when you play kind of more high-octane, noisy recordings, some turntables do like to, especially some belt drive models, do like to kind of muddy things when they get really angular and dense. And the Reed, plowed right through. Didn't have any issue tracking any of that high distortion information.
Just a brief interruption, esteemed viewers. As you may know, I'm Tom Martin, Chief Content Officer of The Absolute Sound. We have a new product. It's on the Substack platform, and we're going to do some interesting things with Substack. First of which is reader questions and answers. Each Monday, readers will submit questions. We'll pick the most interesting ones, and we'll answer the questions on Friday. We'll also have early access to articles and special blogs that don't appear anywhere else. We hope you'll join us. It's only a cost of a cup of coffee per month. Just check on the screen or in the show notes below. Thanks, and now back to the show.
About 2/3 of the way into this review, I did attempt to do a cartridge swap and swap in a cartridge I was more familiar with, and that is my Hana Umami Red that you see here. Now, the Airtight PC1 is definitely a cartridge that's more on the level of a turntable tonearm setup like the Reed 5T and 1C. Because that cartridge retails for around $10,000. The Umami is a much more modest cartridge at coming in at about $4,000 US. However, I don't think it was out of place on this table. And I did notice some tonal differences, of course, switching cartridges as you're bound to notice. The Airtight is definitely a more soundstage-oriented, resolving, airy cartridge, a really great airy high-end, excellent imaging, soundstage, all of that. But when I swapped to the Umami, I felt like I added a lot more meat on the bone, and the bass kind of plumped up, and everything became a much more fleshed out image. And I'm sure I lost some of that excellent like orchestral soundstage depth, and some of that super pinpoint wide sound staging that the Airtight had. But you get a little bit of that funk and boogie, and I think that's one thing the Umami is really good at. It's a really balanced cartridge that still is able to have a lot of that meat and depth, and it's definitely a cartridge that I think punches above its price class, and it wasn't embarrassed by the Airtight by any means. They were just different flavors of tonal quality. Now, attempting to do a cartridge setup myself, I've set up a lot of cartridges over the last couple years in audio and in turntables, and I set up a lot of different types of cartridges, but I've never had a setup that took quite as long as this, because maneuvering the 5T tonearm in a cartridge setup is very different. Now, Reed provides a very seemingly simple alignment protractor for you to use. It has a number of different 0 points on here that you are supposed to set your cartridge overhang up to, and then of course an alignment protractor right here in the center. So I thought, okay, no problem, but it was very, very finicky because you're supposed to do it with the motor on, and it did. I was able to accomplish it, but just know that cartridge setup on this is not a simple affair, and it will take a little bit of time and patience and careful attention to the directions that Reed provide. One of my reference orchestral recordings that I like to pull out for a number of reasons, because of imaging, because of soundstage positioning, and because of the ability of tone arms and cartridges and turntables to track cleanly the really, really, really dynamic and complex passages in this piece. I like to get out my 45 RPM classic records cut of the Ravel Alvarado del Gracioso with Paul Perret and the Detroit Symphony on Mercury Living Presence. These Mercury Living Presence classic records 45 RPM cuts are outstanding. I don't think there's ever been a better pressing of just classic Mercury recordings than these 45 classics. And this is an amazing recording and will sound good on any turntable, but there's a number of things I listen for when seeing how a turntable, tone arm, etc. do with this recording. And one of that is when if there's any smearing of imaging, smearing of detail in these really, really big dynamic moments of the piece, because Bernie Grundman cut huge dynamics into the 45 RPM cut of this recording, and there's lots of big swells and percussive hits, powerful bass drum, and some of it all can combine together in a very, very overwhelming and powerful experience. And what you want to make sure is that there isn't really any kind of smearing of the individual instruments when those climaxes happen. And I will say this tone arm handled those amazingly. I mean, there was just never any loss of image, never any loss of stability, even in the most loud and dynamic sections. With every instrument is kind of playing at fortissimo. Everything was just as clear and detailed as it was in the more subtle pianissimo sections. So hats off to the Reed on that front. I played Bobby Hutcherson's Oblique. This is a Tone Poet reissue cut by Kevin Gray, featuring Herbie Hancock on the piano. And I love these Bobby Hutcherson vibraphone recordings for testing equipment, because the vibraphone is such a complex instrument, because it has one of the strongest transient attacks of any instrument, and it's got to be clear and ringing and like a bell, and really have that front end impact, but also have this huge long ring and decay, and the complexity of the overtones when the vibraphone is spinning, is vibrating like the instrument that it is. I thought the rendering and the combination of the Hana and the Reed tone arm and the Reed table was great. The vibraphone had a really, really long decay, but I especially enjoyed listening to Herbie Hancock's piano on this. I thought, I'm used to that Blue Note sound where the piano is just shoved right against the wall, against the curtained wall in Rudy Van Gelder's studio. We're all used to that. And so I'm just expecting whenever I put on a 50s or 60s Blue Note recording that I'm going to be listening to a kind of muted piano sound, a kind of dead piano sound. And there was a little of that. I mean, the piano definitely didn't have a lot of ring down low, but on this recording, on this turntable, Hancock's piano had this great upper air ring to it, a very clear transient response and kind of overtone and air around the piano that, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't, like listening to Radu Lupu's piano on the Decca recording, but for a Blue Note recording, I thought this was really, really good. And when I get my other turntable set back up, I want to go back and listen to this and go, am I going to get the same piano sound in there? Because it's just not something I'm used to hearing with these recordings. Finally, while I was conducting this review, a very special record arrived, and that is the Analog Productions UHQR pressing of the White Stripes 2003 album Elephant. This is a pretty monumental vinyl record pressing for a number of reasons, because it's the first time we're getting a super, super intensive audiophile, 45 RPM, no holds barred box set from Analog Productions of, a somewhat recent title. I mean, it's not that recent. 2003 was 20 years ago, but compared to, a lot of audiophile fare, this is new music. And, I grew up with, Seven Nation Army. I grew up with a lot of these songs on the radio, and I've owned, with regular third man pressing of this album for a number of years now. And I always thought it sounded good, but it was never an impactful album to me. And all of that kind of changed when I played it on the Reed 5T and 1C. I mean, some of the guitar sounds that Jack White makes on this, he's really playing with the the tone controls for various songs on his rig, you do hear a lot of the depth and texture of the different guitar tones he's going for throughout this album. It doesn't just sound like, sometimes we listen to a rock record on a subpar mixing and mastering or subpar equipment, and it just sounds like, that's guitar. There's some distortion, but to really listen to all the different sounds that an electric guitar is able to make, all the different, high frequency buzzing and ringing, and there's some points on this I could almost hear the kind of the fabric on his cab. You can almost hear it flapping with the sound, that kind of visceral, cab-driven guitar sound that you hear, at a local venue. The kind of stuff that I was hearing when I was going to see, guitar bands playing at like the old emos in downtown Austin, where it was just like, there may be a mixing board back there and a PA doing a little bit of house sound, but most of what the audience is hearing is straight out of the cab, and that's really the sense you get on this recording when played through the Reed setup. Another thing I noted is that, you can kind of tell when you play, this mastering on this setup that, Meg White does not have the most massive drum set. It feels almost more like a jazz kit in some ways. It's a very minimal setup, and the bass drum she's playing on is it almost feels like one of those smaller jazz bass drums, those jazz kick drums. But there's certain parts of this, especially I remember in like Ball and Biscuit, where she's really, really banging on that bass drum. I mean, using all her might on the kick. And it's almost like when you take one of those instruments that's really at its max, like those smaller bass drums, and you really hear the hit on that when someone is really playing it to its max, like in some of those old jazz recordings when like Max Roach or some of those other people are really just banging the shit out of the kit. You can hear the kind of the drum head being pushed to its limits, and that was something that was rendered so cool on this table, and it's one of those like magical moments you have when you're listening, where you're like can really sense what the performer is going through with their instrument, the way the performer is interacting specifically with their physical equipment. It's really cool. It comes across very well on the Reed. Lastly, throughout my my years in hi-fi, I've tried to amass kind of a collection of test records that I know really well that aren't your typical, test records. There's no Sheffield track record in my test record stack. But one that I turn to a lot is a really excellently mastered 80s Japanese pop album by Henri, simply called Cool. And you may be thinking, why am I pulling this out? Well, because there's a little interesting story to this album. And that's that this was actually recorded in Los Angeles with LA musicians. See, Henri's producer throughout the 80s was a guitarist and instrumentalist and songwriter named Toshiki Katamatsu, and he was a big deal in his own right and had his own catalog, of his own of great music. But he was a songwriter for Henri, this Japanese pop singer. And in 1983 or 84, I can't remember, they went over to LA to record with some of the best musicians in LA at the time. And who do I mean by that? I mean, these were the guys that were playing on Thriller. Let's see what we have here. We have Leon Chancellor on drums and Ed Green, Nathan East on bass, Paul Jackson, Carlos Rios, and of course Toshiki Katamatsu on guitar, Don Grusin on piano and synthesizers, Ernie Watts on saxophone, trumpet. We have Jerry Hay, Gary Grant, and Larry Hill, Charlie Loper on trombone, percussion, Paulino da Costa, just a ton of the biggest names in working studio musicians in LA at the time. I mean, these guys played on some of the best recordings. I think, Nathan East was Eric Clapton's bass player for a number of years. And so there's some really solid playing on this, and there's some really solid recording too. This was recorded in extremely well. Some of, up there with like Thriller and Off the Wall for me, and how good the recording is. And the cutting of this, despite this being a record that was only released in Japan, it was mastered and cut by Bernie Grunman at Bernie Grunman Mastering. It's one of those cool little tidbits. And so this is a great sounding, kind of silly disco record, but it's a great sounding record. But one of the things I love using for this is not only just the dynamics and the sounds of the horns on this record for testing hi-fi equipment, but also the drums. This has one of the most impactful, dynamic, but also driest drum sounds I've ever heard on a record. I mean, it really sounds like they were doing that like blanket over the drum head thing with a lot of these the drum recording on this album. But so I'm used to playing this, and it just has this incredible groove and rhythm and pacing on any turntable I play it on. But one thing that I was listening to, and it wasn't super apparent at first, but the more I was listening, I was realizing that all these like super dry 80s disco like percussive things that I was hearing, suddenly there was air and there was space around them. You know, Leon Chancellor's drums, like a lot of the toms, if you listen to it on a standard turntable, I almost never would hear any type of air or tone around the drums. It was just like a smack, a hit, and that's it. It was a percussive effect, and not necessarily, you weren't listening to the tone or the tuning of the drums so much. You know, these drums are so dry, it's almost like the tuning didn't really matter. But I did hear tone on this, especially on the kick drum. I was not used to hearing, you know, any type of specific note on the kick drum on this recording. But on this turntable, this tone arm, I was hearing it was fleshed out. It was three-dimensional. There was decay to it. I mean, this is supposed to be one of the driest drum recordings out there, but there was actually serious, you know, decay around each of the individual drums and of the instrument in general. That was surprising to me. And it makes me think that there's really something to the combination of the tracking system on this tone arm and the drive system, because it's able to pull out things that I'm just not used to hearing in records that I'm very familiar with. So the combination of, you know, the Reed 5T tone arm and the 1C Muse with the rim drive system, the friction drive system, you know, this is getting up there in super table territory. I mean, this is a turntable tone arm combination that comes in just shy of $40,000. And so I'm highlighting all these things it's doing well, but in reality, these are things it should be doing well, because this is a very expensive pairing of gear. Now, could you get this exact turntable with a less costly tone arm? Yes, absolutely. And Reed do sell that combination, but I haven't heard that combination. I've only heard the turntable tone arm combination that we have here in front of me. I think it handles things excellently. It doesn't have a bassy sound. I was kind of expecting a lot of bass weight with this type of setup, but it is definitely a more, I would say, the where this turntable excels is in you know, mid-range tonality, air around the instruments, transient response, absolute solidity of soundstage and imaging, which is, I think, the greatest strength of this table, and also decay of acoustic instruments. Very impressed by. If you are someone that listens to a lot of acoustic instruments, whether that be jazz or classical, and you really want to hear the subtlety of the tonal and resonant qualities of those instruments, I think this combination could definitely really get you there. And I know that's a dragon that a lot of people who listen to you know, vinyl, especially older recordings from the 50s and the 60s, that's a dragon a lot of listeners are chasing. And so I definitely think you should put the Reed on your audition list. So I was very impressed by the combination of these components, the rim drive and the tangential tracking tone arm. Despite their complexity, despite their headaches and setup, and despite the fact that I don't think I would want to ever live far away from an authorized dealer with a setup like this in case I ever ran into any technical you know, questions, complications, or issues. Despite those challenges, this is maybe what you're after in the high end, something that has come up with a unique solution to the problems inherent in tone arm design, the problems inherent in playing a circular black disc, a record. I think the Reed offers a brilliant solution to that in a truly engaging listening experience. So those are my thoughts listening to the Reed 1C and 5T. But what do you think? Let us know down in the comments, and we will see you next time with more reviews and exclusive content. Take care.